So I'm delighted to welcome you to What's the Big Deal with Big Data, the Future of Communication. This event is the first of its kind at the University of Maryland, and our topic this evening is about big data.
Awesome. So how you guys doing? We're going to have a conversation about data. And so I'm excited to be here with the panelists to have this discussion. I think before we hop into it, I truly believe that the data that we have in our society, in our government, in our social media, in our professions, can truly change the value proposition of the things that we do, the decisions that we make, the policies that we set, in a wide range of aspects. And so with that in mind, I kind of wanted to give the panelists the opportunity to just tell a little bit more about yourself. We can just go straight down, and then we'll kind of get into the questions. I have some pre-thought out questions, but I also want to invite everyone to think of some questions. If you brought some questions, we have a mic over here that we'll use as we go through the process, okay? Awesome. So, who wants to go first? You're standing closest. You're closest, so you're good.
This is the part where we introduce ourselves?
Yes, this is the part where we introduce yourselves.
Okay. Better? Better? Much better. All right. So, my name's Michael Koppenheffer. I work at a place called the Advisory Board Company, which is not the same thing as the Communications Department Advisory Board, which I've heard about as well. We're a research and consulting and technology company. We're based here in DC. And I was telling a few people earlier, I've worked there since 1993, like a really long time. And the way I ended up there was that I was an English major, which is not as good as being a communications major. And when you're an English major and you graduate from college, and especially in a bad recruiting year like 1993, there's not a lot you can do. So I moved to DC and stayed on my college roommate's floor and looked for a job. And all I knew how to do was read and write. Because I went to a liberal arts college. And so I was looking at the time there really wasn't the internet, and so you looked in the Washington Post classifieds, and I looked under research and writing, and I interviewed for any job that would take me that had research or writing in it. I ended up at this place called the Advisory Board, and it seemed to have worked out okay, because I'm still there after coming and going a few times. But what I do now, the reason I think I'm up here, is I'm in charge of all of our publishing and communication. So we work with colleges and universities, but mostly actually with healthcare organizations, and we help them fulfill their missions better. So we help hospitals and healthcare providers get better. We help colleges get smarter. And so in so doing, we publish about 100 books a year. We have a website that gets about 1.5 million visitors a month. We write something like 2,000 blog posts a year. So we generate a whole lot of content, and data is integral to that in two ways. One is data is how we direct and manage our performance and do better. So as Malka Goldberg, who's sitting there, who's a advisory board web editor, will attest, we pay a ton of attention to data about performance of the content we create, because we use that to help understand what works, what doesn't, what people care about, what doesn't, and then that informs what we do afterwards. Equally important, we actually use data to learn things about the world. So among other things, we have about half of all the inpatient admissions that happen in this country flow through advisory board systems. So we know a ton about the health care that people actually get in this country. We actually know a ton about student performance as well on the education side. And we use that data to generate insights about the world that then we can share and apply. So look forward to talking about both things.
Awesome.
Hi, so I'm Bill Rand. I actually have a little bit of a different story coming forward from that, in that I come from the technical side of things. I'm actually a computer scientist by training. That's where my PhD is in. But along the way, it became very clear that building computer models of interesting phenomenon and understanding big data was kind of useless if no one understood what you were trying to tell them, right? And so I really became interested in trying to understand how humans behave, how they interact, how they use social media, how they use other methods before social media to talk to each other, and then trying to figure out how can we present those findings and understandings to others, right? And so I now teach marketing for a living. I'm in the marketing department here and have a joint appointment in marketing and computer science. And I also direct something called the Center for Complexity in Business, which has a weird name, but basically was a data science group before the word data science was really popular, right? And so we were kind of interested in taking large-scale data, understanding the system, large-scale data, understanding the systems by which that data was organized, how individual decisions led to increasingly more complex behavior, right? And how we could understand that complex behavior by understanding individual behavior, right? And so fundamentally, I use big data to build better models of human understanding, to better understand how humans behave in the world, right? And that's really what I'm interested in. That's what I'm passionate about. And I think that's why I'm here on this panel today.
Awesome. Mike? Not sure.
Is it on?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'm Frank Petruca, and I have my own company called Definitive Communications. I'm a graduate of Cornell University, where I studied liberal arts, international social relations to be exact. And I was really confused about what I wanted to do when I graduated college. I worked for a German scientific technical publishing company called Springer Verlag. Then I went on to Business Week. Then I went on to the New Yorker, and spent a couple of years in New York just working in the publishing business on the promotion and marketing side. Then I took a wrong turn, and I spent 5 years in sales and management for Berlitz International, and kind of got off track, and then decided to get back on track. And I got a job with the Institute for International Research. And interestingly enough, I was trained in New York, but then they heard me speaking Spanish on the phone one day and decided that I should help them open their office in Santiago, Chile. And which was funny because I was not quite proficient in Spanish. And so my job when I got down there was to run conferences on technology issues. So here I am in Chile interviewing CIOs and CTOs and trying to find out what the latest trends are in telecommunications and information technology. As you have heard, I have no technical background. So it was really quite a challenge. And why I mention this is because it really forced me to learn how to talk to technical people and to figure out what was important and what the meaning was, because these techies just didn't understand what real people needed. So I came back to the States and I moved to Washington at that point, and I worked for a management consulting firm called A.T. Kearney, where I did the marketing and communications for their telecommunications division. Then I got excited about the tech boom that was happening here in town and joined a public relations firm called The Launch Company that specialized in promoting high-tech startups. And that was a wild party for a few years. We were helping all sorts of companies trying to get their names out there. And I think the one that's still standing is Sylvan, which I met Steve Drake at. And, but most of our startups didn't really pan out that well. And in about May of 2001, the whole tech boom just went bust. And a lot of PR people were looking for jobs. So at that point, I became self-employed, and I'm still self-employed, and I worked with a lot of different companies. Most interestingly, I worked with NASA out in Silicon Valley, and I was hired by the CIO of Ames Research Center to help them de-geek content. So I would talk to engineers, and you know, this several years ago, I remember having conversations about what is cloud computing? And so I would talk to engineers and try to figure out what it was and why it was important, and more importantly, what to tell the policymakers back here in DC. because they're not going to spend 10, 20, $100 million on something if they don't understand it. I have a slide that I'll show later that talks about one of the applications from NASA using big data. The NASA experience really motivated me to write a super communicator because I felt that people really need to understand that a lot of technically minded people just don't know how to talk to real people.
Hi, my name is Scott Hampel, and yes, I am related to Dale Hampel, for those of you who have him as a professor. So anyway, I work here at Riggs Hall as a market segmentation analyst. I pull data from the data warehouse, analyze the data, see how we can get people, alumni, parents, and students to donate to the school to finance your scholarships and other activities here at the University of Maryland. Previous to that, I was in big data before big data was cool. I have almost 30 years experience in analyzing data, previously in the market research realm, but then with the technological changes to computers, the data keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So 30 years ago, our limit was 1 meg of data. Now I'm typically doing 20, 25 megs of data on doing analysis of that. We collect information on people who have graduated from school, their parents, the students and employees, and we look at how we can raise more money. I have a lot of experience in the CPG, the consumer packaged goods, as well as utility industry and the hospitality industry. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you guys. And so I'm going to start off with a question or two. Once again, if you have a question, feel free to go to the mic and we'll kind of keep it fluid. So thank you guys for that. I thought that was really good. My first question for the panel would be, in your own kind of professions, in your industries, can you just talk about how data is used? What's data kind of to you? Some people might consider data to be kind of like ones and zeros, or just data elements in a database. But what is it to you from your profession? Is it evidence? Is it more than that? And could you kind of elaborate on it to kind of set the stage of kind of what data is in your profession? And feel free to, whoever wants to go first. Go ahead. You look like you're going to say something. You got it.
Sure. So I think I can say, there's kind of two ways in which I use data. And one is to do science, right? Like I use data to understand how humans interact, how humans behave, as I mentioned in my overview. The kind of data that I look at there, just to give you an idea, is primarily social media data right now, right? We pull down lots and lots of Twitter data, and we look at how people are tweeting at each other, how they're interacting with each other, what they're saying to each other, and then we try and build models to understand how people are using social media and how they could change that stuff in the future, right? Now, I also do, the second aspect of what I do is I work with companies that are interested in making smarter and better business decisions about what they're doing. And I look at their data to try and help them in that process and help them make those decisions, right? And that data can be all sorts of kinds of data. It could be, for instance, loyalty card data about what kind of purchases people have made in the past and how they're, and trying to estimate things like their customer lifetime value, for instance. It could be a case recently where we're looking at intelligent vehicles, so these little chips that are placed on fleets of trucks, trying to understand how they're driving around, making deliveries, where they're delivering. And one question they've asked us recently is, are people stealing fuel out of these trucks, right? They're parked at a truck stop, for instance, for a while. Can we find that? Can we figure out where that's happening? And then can we tell our drivers to avoid those situations in the future, right? That this is a spot that's been a high crime area, right? And so you should drive around it, right? And so, part of that also involves trying to teach people the skills of how to set up and manage and operationalize a big data operation, right? And so that's a way in which I also deal with big data, is not in necessarily actually using it, but teaching other people how to use it as well. So I would say those are kind of the 2 or 3, I think I may have listed 3 there, major ways that I deal with big data.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, when I was working at McCormick, the spice company up in Baltimore, we took that supermarket scanner data from IRI and Nielsen, and we had to do the who, what, when, where, and how of how many bottles of black pepper we were selling, where we were selling that black pepper, what price were people buying that bottle of black pepper, what stores were selling the black pepper, and also what kind of effect, if any, the advertising had on the sales of black pepper. So it is really a good way to really understand people's purchase behaviors. And the only thing I really found that is really lacking was the why. Why people bought McCormick black pepper as opposed to the store brand or any other brand. And that's where I think the big question mark is in big data, and we really don't have no real grasp on why people do what they do. We can see how many times they bought the black pepper in the last 6 months, but we don't know why they bought that much.
So everybody's stealing my good lines, but because I use data in all those ways, and probably more at work. One way that I use data, honestly, is to satisfy my craving for validation. And what I mean by that is I love working in digital communications, and because you have so much data that tells you about whether you've done a good job or not, and that allows you to make decisions, business decisions, based on that help you do an even better job in the future. So I did take a break from working at the advisory board for a little while. I was a reporter for a while, and being a reporter is fine, but you have absolutely no validation that what you did means anything. So you file a story at the end of the day. I did hard news, I've covered healthcare. You file a story, you go home, you repeat again the next day, and you don't really have any sense of the impact of what you do, and you don't know, boy, if I'd only written that story a little shorter, people would have appreciated more. If I'd written it longer, it would have been better. There's no way to get better. There's no way to improve. And so one of the ways that we use data, or I think big data is a fancy word for data, but really, one of the ways that we use lots of information is that every time we communicate something out into the world, we look at its impact. We look at social media, we look at page views, we look at what users did after they encountered that piece of information, and then we use it to make business decisions afterwards, which I find exciting because I feel like you know if you did a good job or not, and you know what decisions you could make to get better. And sometimes even we merge 2 of the things Bill brought up, which is science and business decisions. If we're really lucky, we can actually set up experiments that are controlled that allow us to use data to tell us what's better. So we'll try this subject line in an email versus this one, and we'll see how it affects open rate. We'll try making a button blue versus green, and we'll see if that affects click, and so forth.
So Ryan, I don't so much work with data as I work with people who work with data. So as a communicator, and I understand that we have a lot of budding communicators here, I think it's really important to understand the context in which we're approaching data as a society. The internet and cloud computing and so many technological advancements over the past 2 decades have really changed the communication game. We have trillions of bytes of information out there in cyberspace just ready to pulse through our fingers, and we need to figure out a way to communicate that big data. Our minds are, we're only human, and now we have all this data coming at us, and we're kind of freaking out in a way because we don't know how to process it all. And so communicators of the 21st century need to really change a lot of what has been done over the past several centuries. And 2 things that I think are really important are storytelling and visual communication. If you think about it, the written word has only been around for about 4,000 years. Infographics have been around for 40,000 years. If you think of a cave drawing, that's 40,000 years. So we were communicating visually for a very long time. So this idea of all these words, these long texts, we have so much information now, none of us can really stand to read all that much. So we really need to figure out how to take all this information, all this data that is just completely bombarding us, and we have to figure out how we can mold it into something that people can really get. So you see the rise of infographics, and you see the rise of data visualization. So that's one important aspect. The other thing is storytelling. We like stories. We don't like to just hear, this is this because this is this. We want to, be brought into something, and we want to have some sort of emotion. And with all that data, we're looking for a human angle into the data. So storytelling, which is actually becoming more of an art, is something that we need to consider. So we're really reframing communication because there is so much data out there.
Awesome. That really brings kind of a follow-up question in around storytelling. So, data can be used a number of ways. So take politics. You'll hear politicians use the same data different ways, and to tell stories from different angles. Could you kind of elaborate, and this really for the whole panel, just kind of elaborate on how data can be leveraged to tell multiple sides of the story based on the vantage point, based on kind of what you're seeing in your professions as far as storytelling. I think that's a very, very good point. I think that's where we ultimately are going to. Thoughts?
I have a really boring example. Do you guys want a boring example? So as I mentioned, our company we actually have lots of data about healthcare in America and how people use it. And we actually have data scientists, which, by the way, do you guys know what a data scientist? It's a statistician who was embarrassed to say they're a statistician, so they call it data scientists. So we have people who got jobs calling themselves data scientists, and they look at the data we have and they try to discern trends, and they try to figure out what's going on in hospitals. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? And honestly, they can't produce anything useful. And it's really sad, but they don't have any context. They don't know what the story is. They don't know what the narrative is. And so they don't actually even know where to start looking. They can't design the experiments without help. And I had this, I'm sort of answering your question, believe it or not.
No, that's good.
So I had this experience a few months ago when a group of our data scientists were looking at our one data set, which is about hospital quality and how long people stay in the hospital, all these things about people's hospital stays. And they're saying, we really want to publicize it. It's important that the world knows that we're great at data. What stories can you find here? And what we ended up finding is they sort of just dumped a bunch of reasons people go in the hospital, how long they stay, trends. It was just a mess. There was no story there. There was no narrative. There was no lead. And just because I had years ago done research about orthopedics when people get their knee and hip replaced, so I knew kind of about it. I was like, why don't you look at that? And it was just a guess. And there actually was a trend there that, interestingly, it was interesting to me, I told you it was boring, but that across the last 2 years, there's like a 25% decrease across the country in the amount of time that people stay in a hospital when they get their knee and hip replaced. And you're like, so what? It's one of the most common reasons people go to the hospital, so it actually is sort of a significant trend. But the way that I made it into a story is that I happen to remember from research I did like 10 years ago that there are basically only two kinds of orthopedics programs in hospitals. There's the average kind where someone goes and gets their hip replaced and it takes about 4 days, and there's the really well-run kind where it's like clockwork. They call it like a joint replacement camp, and they do all these things different. It's really well organized, and people get out in 2 days. And so what I did was I was able to take the context I had and I imposed a narrative on this finding. So the finding was 25% decrease over 2 years, whatever. Not really a story. The story I told was joint replacement in America is getting way better really fast. And to your point, I kind of made that up based on the data. There could have been another reason. You could tell that story many different ways, including something about insurance companies not paying for extra data. Like, I don't know, but I think I'm right. And I did a little validation to make sure I'm right. But I want to get a couple points across. One is, you're right. You can, like, with data, it's all about the story you tell, and you can tell myriad stories. But the point I also want to get across was the fact that the real value of doing any of this work is the story you're able to tell out of it. Nobody's able, like, there's no good in telling people, like, 25% reduction or whatever. You have to figure out what's meaningful to your audience, and you have to be able to tell the story around that.
Very good point.
Told you it was boring.
Let me follow up quickly on that, because I have a little bit slightly different perspective on what data science is. In that I often consider myself a data scientist, right?
You didn't take stat?
but I think of storytelling as being an integral part of data science, is what I would argue, right? That data science is composed of three things: data, right, which is trying to understand how you get data, how you filter it, how you load it into an appropriate form so you can actually represent it interestingly. Science, which is building models on that data, analyzing that data, understanding it. And then I do think storytelling is an integral part. So I think maybe the data scientists you're hiring aren't the good data scientists. But
You recruit in Maryland, obviously.
and by that I mean things like business acumen, right? Understanding of the subject matter, right? A real data scientist would have knowledge at that space as well, right? And so that's just, sorry, a small aside, but to get to the point of how data can actually have multiple sides, I definitely believe that's the case, right? Data is essentially collected or not collected, or you make the decision to collect it partially based upon what you think is going to be interesting or what you're going to find valuable. And that decision alone places a bias on the data, right? So the fact that you're actually grabbing this data, or that someone bothered to collect this data, means that the data is not completely neutral, right? It has some sort of values entailed within it, right? Sorry, I have a philosophy of science background as well, so I might get a little too philosophical. But anyways, the truth of the matter is that none of that matters until the data is actually represented to other people, right? And so the communication of that data becomes the most valuable part in the storytelling of what's going on with that data. What's in that data is trying to figure out, how can I look at what's happening here? How can I look at what's being processed and then communicate it to others in a way that tells a story and that resonates with those people, resonates with the stakeholders, right? So for instance, just to quickly wrap up, right, the truth of the matter is that when you have data scientists, for instance, embedded in companies, which we often do nowadays, who are looking at data, if they're not doing something that is going to change a manager's decision, right? If that manager is not going to increase an ad campaign or reach out to this customer or do something, then to some extent that data is not useful, right? And so you have to be able to help make that turn that data from data into knowledge and insights, which results in action, right? And that can be done in multiple different ways by multiple different views, depending upon what you're looking at and what you're trying to understand.
So I brought an example of a data visualization, which I think might help drive home the point that we're trying to get across. Can you put the data visualization up?
Oh.
So as I mentioned, with data visualization, there is just so much. There. Okay, so this is a data visualization provided by NASA, the Goddard Research Center, not too far from here. And what do you think it's showing? Right? And there's a lot of research out there on climate change. And you know, we read things in newspapers and journals, and there's all sorts of data coming in that tells us that temperatures are rising. And you know, but people still don't want to believe that maybe we're doing something that's influencing the climate on the planet Earth. So at NASA, they have a data visualization studio where basically they take all these numbers and they crunch them into a graphic. And that graphic tells a story. So this is a very impactful way of talking about climate change. Although at NASA, they're not allowed to use the term climate change because that's for the politicians to decide. But anyway, they're allowed to collect data that shows what is projected to happen on planet Earth, and it's going to be a really hot place in not too long if this data is correct. But the important element is that the visual has you all captivated, but it's telling a story. And so you're not actually looking at the numbers, well, it's going to be 103 degrees in Tucson in 2017. You're looking at the big picture. And with data, you can easily focus on small elements, but ultimately it's the big picture scenario that helps us understand what's really going on. And I think this data visualization really shows us, gee, we got to do something.
That's very interesting. So go ahead.
I'm sorry. In the corporate world, we're trying to find who our best customers are. And we have to paint that picture of what their ages are, what their gender is, what's their household incomes, what's their cultures. And we really want to be able to keep our existing customers and find customers who match those same characteristics as prospects. So in summary, we want to be able to not only retain these customers, but also try to upsell and cross-sell other stuff to